Greetings, friends. You are on the Ruslan Bailov channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine as of September 28, 2025. A large number of very important events have taken place today, so let's get started. We will begin with the Zaporizhzhia sector of the front, where units of the Vostok grouping continue their offensive. Over the past 24 hours, there have been minor adjustments along the line of contact. According to pro-Ukrainian cartographers, pro-Russian analysts, and neutral mapmakers, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to improve their positions near the settlement of Kalinovskoye and advanced close to the settlement of Verbovoye. In other words, we can see that the Russian army is not planning to halt its push. There were reports that the Ukrainian side redeployed reinforcements to this sector and announced an evacuation. Yet despite all these measures, it seems that those forces were never actually committed to battle. It looks as though the Russian army anticipated counterattacks, but apparently this was merely a bluff on the part of the Ukrainian General Staff. Once the Russian forces realized the situation, the offensive resumed, perhaps at a slightly slower pace, but nevertheless continued. Overall, the tempo here depends not only on the intentions of Russian units, but also on the fact that the main phase of the offensive in the Zaporizhzhia direction has already been completed, with Russian forces now pressing up against two major fortified zones, Uspanovsky and Poltavsky. And as you can see, the first geolocations and footage of objective control have already started to appear, showing that units of the Vostok group have begun striking with drones at the first buildings and structures inside the Uspanovsky stronghold, on the eastern Russian-held side of the Yanchel River, specifically these farms. This clearly indicates the beginning of direct hostilities on this part of the front. Next, we move to the Pokrovsk direction, where fierce battles continue both on the western flank and in the northeast. On the western axis, Russian forces have begun gradually advancing toward the Pokrovskaya mine, located north of the settlement of Udaknoye and northwest of Kotlino. Today, pro-Ukrainian cartographers confirmed that the armed forces of the Russian Federation have fully cleared the settlement of Udaknoye, and everything is now in place for a further move northward. There is also geolocation evidence confirming Russian control over the ventilation shafts located between Kotlino and Udaknoye. Footage shows drone strikes against Russian assault troops moving through this territory. Step by step, the Russian army is advancing northward toward the M30 highway and Sergeyevka. Let me remind you, if Russian forces establish control over the Pokrovskaya mine, they will be able to consolidate control over the main supply lines leading toward Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. Some pro-Ukrainian experts are already reporting that supply to Pokrovsk and Mirnograd essentially no longer exists, since Russian forces established fire control over these routes quite some time ago. Now let's examine the situation in the northeast in the breakthrough zone. Recall that in September, the Russian army launched an offensive using reconnaissance and sabotage groups, which within a short time managed to penetrate deeply into Ukrainian defensive lines, reaching as far as the second defensive tier. After that, the Ukrainian side launched counter-offensives, and for more than a month now, fighting has continued with the sole Ukrainian goal of cutting off this salient. So far, however, they have not succeeded. Starting from September 23-24, Ukraine launched yet another counter-offensive, aiming to advance toward the settlement of Boykovo and through Zapovednoye toward the settlement of Mayak. Ukrainian forces have also attempted to attack from Vladimirovka in the direction of Novotoretskoye. This was the most recent offensive, designed to sever the salient once and for all and encircle the Russian grouping. By September 24th, Ukrainian units were reported to be present in Novotoretskoye. On September 25th, reports indicated that Zapovednoye had come under Ukrainian control. This means the supply corridor for Russian forces narrowed to less than 2 kilometers for overland logistics northward. At the same time, however, Russian forces began a regrouping operation, which apparently succeeded. By September 27th, reports emerged that the armed forces of the Russian Federation had launched their own counterstrike. During this operation, Russian forces managed to seize full control of the settlement of Dorozhnoye, along with its railway station, Mertsalovo. This adjustment was already noted yesterday, September 27th, Based on objective control footage published by the Ukrainian side, the strikes were recorded within Dorozhnoye itself, showing Russian soldiers trying to establish defensive positions and hide from Ukrainian drones. Today, this information has also been confirmed by neutral cartographers, with updates reflected on their maps. So what is the overall situation? The Ukrainian side launched what they viewed as a decisive offensive to cut off the salient, but apparently their advance bogged down in local battles. This, in turn, gave Russian forces the opportunity to counterattack. Now the situation is such that Ukrainian units, which had previously cleared Zapovednoye and approached Boykovo, may themselves risk being completely encircled. This marks a turning point in the battle for the breakthrough zone. At this stage, the Russian army truly has the chance to surround Ukrainian troops and straighten the front line from Rodinskoye to Dorozhnoye, creating an impenetrable barrier for Ukrainian formations. If the Russian army manages to do this, any further talk of cauldrons for Russian forces or cutting off the salient will be irrelevant. It would mean the establishment of a stable bridgehead with a dense network of strongpoints, supported by a railway line, forcing the Ukrainian side to revert to defense and attempt to find new ways to prevent further Russian advances toward Rodinskoye, Belitskoye, and of course Dobropolye. Now let us move to the Siversk-Lyman sector, where the Russian army continues clearing operations in the settlement of Zareknoye. Today, Ukrainian sources published footage showing Ukrainian forces using Bradley IFVs to strike Russian positions south of Zareknoye inside the forest belt. Based on this footage, we can make certain clarifications. At present, Ukrainian forces still hold the southwestern part of Zareknoye. Russian troops are attempting to outflank this stronghold and strike into the rear of the defending Ukrainian group. These counterattacks by the AFU are aimed at stabilizing the situation and preventing a breakthrough on the flanks. In the area of the settlement of Siversk, the picture is beginning to clear up. Today, experts report that the entire strip of strongpoints between Serebryanka, Dronovka, and Siversk is now a grey zone, with little or no control remaining in the hands of the AFU. The Russian army is completing the clearing of this fortified line north of Siversk, and in the near future, fighting will begin directly for Dronovka itself. Once Dronovka falls, logistical and operational links will be established between Yampol, Zareknoye, Torske, Dronovka, and Siversk. From that moment, one can expect Russian units to advance toward the T-0513 road and, more broadly, toward Siversk from the west and northwest. It would appear that the fate of Siversk is already sealed. That concludes the frontline overview. Now let us look at what happened last night over Ukraine. We begin with yet another massive strike carried out by the Russian army during the night of the 28th, employing both missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. It is worth noting that just a day earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a number of statements. He emphasized that if Russia attempts to plunge Kyiv into a blackout and leave the Ukrainian capital in darkness, then Ukraine will take reciprocal steps to create a similar situation in Moscow. Apparently, the Kremlin did not spend much time deliberating over this warning and chose to treat it as a challenge. This was followed by the massive strike. By early morning, the first maps began to appear, showing the approximate routes taken by Russian loitering drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and even hypersonic weapons. Looking closely at these diagrams, it becomes clear that the main axis of the strikes was directed at Kyiv itself and the wider Kyiv region. Additional strikes were recorded around Konotop, in Starokonstantinov, where F-16s were reportedly stationed, as well as in Zaporizhzhia and Odessa regions. Furthermore, bombardments took place along the Pokrovsk-Kramatorsk line, where heavy fighting is currently ongoing. Ukrainian officials reported that during the night, Russia launched 643 different types of weapons, ranging from drones to missiles. According to their claims, air defense forces intercepted 601 of these targets. If one were to judge by these figures alone, it would seem that Ukraine's air defense system functioned extremely effectively. However, footage of objective control released in the morning paints a very different picture. Numerous photos and videos from Kyiv show entire districts destroyed, buildings reduced almost to rubble, vehicles wrecked, and debris scattered across the streets. As time went on, more and more images and clips surfaced, confirming the scale of the destruction. Another episode took place in Kyiv's industrial zone, where a warehouse or plant was destroyed. An object which, according to analysts, may have been used by the AFU for military purposes, including the assembly of drones. All of these facilities were struck overnight and in the early morning by Russian missiles and drones. And the strikes were not limited to Kyiv. From Bila Tserkva, footage emerged clearly showing a hit on the Hermes shopping mall located in the very center of the city. Pro-Russian analysts have repeatedly noted that the Ukrainian side often uses shopping centers as storage facilities for weapons and other military supplies. From Zaporizhzhia came video footage showing the very first moments after a missile strike on a high-rise residential building. Morning images showed Ukrainian rescue services working to extinguish the fire and deal with the aftermath, attempting to stabilize the situation in the district. It is worth highlighting the view of pro-Russian experts. Despite this strike being among the largest in recent times, Ukraine's air defense did in fact demonstrate significant effectiveness. Analysts suggest that Kyiv may have recently received a fresh batch of modern surface-to-air missiles or launchers. This would explain why that night Ukrainian forces expended costly interceptor missiles against relatively cheap drones. However, such intensive use of stockpiles could mean that in future attacks, Ukraine will not be able to demonstrate the same level of effectiveness. Another important point. Throughout the month of September, Russian forces have increasingly targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Footage has been published showing strikes on transformer substations and power plants in the Nizhyn area of Chernihiv region. And this is just one example. If we analyze the geography of these strikes, the heaviest concentration has been observed in southwestern Ukraine, particularly around Odessa, Transnistria, Moldova, and also near the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant. On a map showing all confirmed strikes since September 1st, a clear pattern emerges. The majority of targets lie along railway lines. These black lines on the map represent Ukraine's key rail routes, along which reinforcements, cargo, and military supplies are transported from Western countries. Thus, strikes on substations and depots are aimed not only at crippling the energy system, but also at complicating the movement of troops and logistics to the front line. Numerous open-source reports already suggest that a significant portion of these facilities has been destroyed or rendered inoperative. In other words, the Russian side is conducting a systematic campaign. Strikes are aimed at reducing Ukraine's logistical capabilities and restricting the delivery of Western aid to frontline areas. That is all from me for today. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave your likes, and all the best to you.